So before we dive into our questions for today, I just would like to remind our viewers that this show comes to you from Cision, a global provider of earned media software and services for PR agencies and comms professionals. I'm your host, Nariman, and in each episode, I will speak with journalists from leading media organizations around the world to answer some of our clients' top questions or biggest questions, like how to attract journalist attention and pitch their story in different markets. How many times should they follow up after sending a release, and more. So make sure to subscribe and follow us. Feel free to send us your questions as well. And we will try to provide you with exclusive insights from the journalism world's largest media organizations. I'm happy to be joined today by Freek Staps, and he's from the editor-in-chief at ANP. ANP is one of the largest media organization or news organizations in the Netherlands and have been our partner for a long time. So before I ask you any question, can you just introduce us to yourself and just tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure thing. So AMP is because that's more important than who I am, of course. But AMP is the national news agency in the Netherlands. So we service basically each and every newsroom that the Netherlands knows. So and we produce a lot of written articles, no video, but still photography, radio, news bulletins, and infographics. I've always been a reporter. I started off as a reporter at a large Dutch newspaper called NRC, and I've been a editor-in-chief at ANP for 3.5 years now. So it's been very nice.
That's wonderful. So you've worked in the US, I believe, right? US and the Netherlands.
That's correct. I've been a correspondent, a U.S. correspondent based in New York for this newspaper. Also, I was a fellow at Columbia University School of Journalism as well.
Yeah. And I think one of the one of my main questions that I would like to know more about is actually if you can tell us a little bit about the media landscape in the Netherlands. I know media has changed a lot in the last 5 years, and maybe even after COVID as well. And we see a lot of reports obviously coming out from different regions about that. So if you can just broadly tell us a bit about the media landscape there.
Sure. So it's actually really lively and vibrant over here. Trust in journalists is still fairly high, I should say, really high compared to some other countries. We do have we have a strong public broadcasting system, but we also have some really strong private media enterprises. One is called DPG. The other one is called Mediahuis, a media house in Dutch, and both of them own a fair share of newspapers and also some online publications and sometimes even radio stations. So actually both do. So there's some really good competition going on, but the rate of Dutch people actually enjoying trustworthy journalism and actually paying for that has never been higher than right now.
That's actually interesting to hear. So what would you say was the biggest challenges for journalism in the last 5 years, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, in the last 10 years, it was definitely how to get people paying for this high quality products, journalism. Basically, a lot of the media companies have solved this puzzle. Of course, it's an ongoing process, and customer services has to be better. But all in all, that problem is pretty much solved. A problem that journalism really has right now is, of course, the safety while doing their work. There's a lot of threats. Being a journalist is not always a safe job. People get harassed either online or on the street, and that is, of course, a main concern of ours.
Yeah, I was looking at this conversation actually that happened on Twitter, and they were discussing the different threats that journalists face, and also the different platforms that they use as well to get their news or communicate with people or get like breaking stories as well, or different stories from people or sources, find different sources. So, what would you say like the most popular platform that journalists would use in the Netherlands?
The most popular platform that
Platform,
journalists use?
social media platform, in case of
Oh,
is
okay.
it, yeah.
For social, well, I do think I don't know the numbers actually. I'm sure there's somebody who knows this much better than I do. But in general, a lot of journalists still use Twitter. Not always to post themselves, but definitely to see what's going on and to keep abreast of latest developments. I also encounter sort of a shift towards LinkedIn. It's not massive, but you definitely see a part of the conversation that used to take place on Twitter is shifting towards LinkedIn. There's not that many journalists that are actually producing for TikTok. And that's still really small scale.
Yeah, I've seen actually few, or I've spoken to a few journalists that started using TikTok.
Mhm.
They do say it's an interesting platform to use. Obviously, a younger generation are using TikTok, but then again, how much information can you actually post in such a small clip?
Yeah, well, yeah. Also, we had that conversation at the start of Twitter. Of course, how many characters do you need
Mhm.
to get your point across? But it's definitely something that journalists worry about. You need a little bit of room for clarity and for maybe for background, or just actually to tell readers or viewers what's going on. Is not always so concise. You cannot always put it in 5 words. Yeah.
I've actually received a message on LinkedIn after we've been producing or publishing these kind of episodes for a while now, and someone basically contacted me because they were interested in reaching out to journalists in the Netherlands, and his question basically was the company called, or actually it's a charity, Human Appeal.
Mhm.
And they basically said that many global brands that don't have presence locally tend to get their press releases ignored by local media, even if the content contains data about the Netherlands. So his question was like how to overcome that. So the difficulty of getting coverage in local media.
I really like that question. That's a really good question, and especially the part where you mentioned, even though they have data on in our case on the Netherlands, because I think that's most important over here. So of course you want to cater your message to appeal to journalists from a certain area or region. And not just cater to them, but if you want to be want to achieve some publicity for your organization, then you definitely want to first you want to figure out what's in it for the journalist, right? I mean, if we're all in communication, and that is the part that binds us, but in communication you always have to think about who is actually my target audience. And what I feel oftentimes is that if people want to reach out to us, and my organization gets about 2,000 press releases per day, so that's quite a number. But if people want to reach out to us, they forget that at the other side of the computer, there is actually a person sitting, and this person is making a selection based on what's relevant for our audience, what's relevant for when it concerns the news. So my advice to the person who asked you this question would be, um, great. It's very smart that you're already thinking about how to include data or something newsworthy concerning a certain region area, for instance, the Netherlands. But also really think, why is this relevant right now? And I do feel that a lot of people who write press releases want to say something instead of understanding that it's a back and forth.
So you would basically say it's not just about having data about the Netherlands, it's also about the way that they write the story and they present this data. Would that be
Sure.
correct?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that's not so. There's actually a couple of layers to unpack here, right? So let's first establish the fact that you always have to think about your audience, and your audience, by the way, is a journalist. If you want to reach a journalist, your audience is a journalist, and your audience is not your executive, because that is sometimes how press releases are written. What would my boss think? That's not so relevant. It's more relevant. What does the journalist need? And then there's the subject. So the subject is, of course, is it newsworthy? And the more selective people are themselves about newsworthiness, the better press releases get, and the more they are actually used on a percentage basis. So please send us less press releases on your great new website, and more press releases on stuff that your organization, which is always very interesting, is doing within that sort of connects to the news. And then to your point, Nariman, is of course, how do you actually convey this message? And what we're seeing oftentimes is press releases that are way too long. And actually, I'm always thinking, does the person that actually wrote this understand how little people are actually reading this? So don't put the news somewhere down below. Put it up there. Just get it out there and make sure that you get your message across. Why is this relevant right now? And the second part I would always recommend is, why is this relevant within the news environment? So, for instance, if there's for instance, if you take the earthquakes, the terrible earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, if your organization is somehow doing something connected to this, feel free to point it out. That helps a journalist to understand why something is actually newsworthy right now. So make a connection to the bigger stories which are already out there.
Yeah, I want to go back back to the asking a little bit more questions about press releases in a bit. But I wanted to ask you first, is there a difference in the way that PR professionals or comms agencies should think about when they approach or reach out to media organization, a big media organization like yours, versus probably like a smaller or medium-sized local news agency or news company?
That's a really good question. Should there be a difference? Well, first of all, the part that's the same is basically understanding your audience and seeing how this relates to the news. I'm thinking, I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure, because I'm not seeing how a smaller news organization would look differently at it. Maybe there are some really small news organizations that actually use your story as a building block for the story that they put, for instance, in a local newspaper. Let's look at it from that perspective. So in their case, actually already provide a couple of facts that are easily made into a story, but in the end, I don't see that much of a difference. No.
I mean, while you were talking, I actually thought about maybe language-wise. Do you think English is acceptable across the Netherlands, or do you think it's better to send in Dutch, for example?
Well, first of all, it's better to send it in Dutch. That's basically because it's easier to understand, it's easier accessible. It's even though a lot of Dutchies actually speak and read English, but it's just more accessible. But apart from that, I'd say English is just fine. That should not be a deterrent. But make sure if you do write your communication in English, make sure that you have an extra obstacle, which is to convince the journalist that this concerns him or her. So be very cognizant about that.
Yeah, thank you. Then going back to the press releases, because that's probably one of the biggest thing that we discuss with clients is how to write a proper press release that would attract journalists' attention. So I just wanted to know, do you think press releases are still relevant, and do journalists still prefer to receive them?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the press release is something that people have been telling each other for decades now, that there must be an end to the press release, but basically we're not seeing it. We still think it's a very smart and well applied way to convey information and to attract the attention of a journalist. So I definitely keep rooting for press releases, basically because it works so much better than cold calling and having to explain your story, and the timing is never right. So I definitely say press releases still work. Do journalists like to receive them? Yes and no. Yes, when they're great, when they're newsworthy, when they're on topic. No, when they're long, when they're not written with the journalist in mind, when they're irrelevant. Basically, like life. You enjoy the great moments, and you sort of wish the bad moments would go away. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually great to know, because I've seen this like similar answer from journalists in different markets. And because every year there's this conversation, as you mentioned, should we stop sending press releases, or do we want to send less press releases? But obviously journalists still want them, but then at the same time just avoid the things that journalists don't like, long press releases, for example,
Yeah.
etc. So I just wanted to ask, like, what are the common mistakes that you see in press releases when clients or when PR comms send them to the Netherlands?
Well, first of all, Nariman, I should say this is I mean, I'm on the receiving end, right, as a journalist. So who am I to judge other people's work? I really want to point that out. Like ignore whatever I want to say, or at least take it with a lot of basically heaps of salt. Because who am I? The only thing I can provide as an insight is, as on the side of journalism, we immediately, simply based on the fact that we receive so many of them, we immediately see the difference between a press release that is actually helpful and a press release that is written because somebody wanted a press release. And the latter part is fairly easily distinguishable, because it doesn't start with the news. It's way too long. Everybody who's involved gets to get a quote in there, and usually the boss or the executive says something that it's a great time to be alive, but in other words. So I would urge everybody writing a press release, be really critical of your own written product, right? Because it can work so well if you put a little bit of extra effort into it, and be. I don't want to offend anybody, of course. I just want to help them by saying, don't be so vain. cut people out of your press release if they don't have an actual great contribution. That it doesn't help. It doesn't help the person who wrote the press release in the first place as well.
Yeah. No, that's understandable.
Was I
Thank you.
kind enough? Was I kind enough?
You were kind enough. Thank you so
Okay.
much for this.
I really don't want to offend anybody's hard work, because I know there's a lot of time being put in there.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a little bit tricky, obviously, because both sides are trying to reach the same thing. They're trying to provide you with information. So I think this sort of feedback could actually be very helpful for both sides, where, you know, the channels of communications are still open and you can give each other feedback so you can reach a common ground. And this is literally the reason why we're having this type of interviews and conversations.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
The question that I wanted to ask is, how would you like to be contacted by journalists as a follow-up step after they send their press releases? Do you think phone calls are okay? Would you rather they just leave you, tell you, come across the release?
That is a question that I still haven't figured out how to answer. Because as a follow-up to a press release, a phone call sometimes helps, but oftentimes it's annoying, and it's really hard to there's a lot of gray between the black and the white here, and I basically, if you're the communication person and you know that your press release is incredibly newsworthy, feel free to call. Really do. Go ahead and call. Also, make sure that during that conversation, within the first 30 seconds, you mention what the news actually is. But also, on the other hand, what I told you before, we have 2,000 press releases being sent to us on a daily basis, and about 5 to 10 of them actually make it into the news. So most of them actually are not that relevant. So I would hate for us to be fielding 2,000 phone calls a day also. So I divide anybody to reach out. Also, I divide anybody to be really critical of how newsworthy it actually is.
And I've heard from other people in different countries that they use WhatsApp sometimes to communicate with journalists, obviously after establishing a relationship. So do you think that's an acceptable method of communicating with journalists?
Yeah, well, I think it's very relevant what you just said there, Nariman, which is after establishing a relationship, because if that's going to be a sort of a new cold calling, I think that it's considered very a personal space. WhatsApp, it's very, very private. You know, it's where you discuss what you're going to have for dinner and where you're going to go out, and what movies you're going to be seeing, and who's going to pick up the kids from school, and if there's also some business conversation going on there, it's tricky. So sure, go ahead, establish a relationship, have a cup of coffee with a journalist, and build from there. And maybe just, you know, why not ask the question, would you like me to tell you, would you like me to contact you when we get something, if there is something that we think is newsworthy. Also, just a little bit of a pro tip, which is of course something that all comms people know, but do tell the journalist that you have an exclusive, and also be transparent and honest about it, right? Never tell somebody you have an exclusive and go to other media as well, because that's going to erode trust right away. But do give exclusives. You know, it does help for a journalist to know that she or he gets to break the news first.
Thank you. Actually, the last thing I was going to say is if you have any last recommendations,
That one.
and that's
Yeah.
a good tip. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it would definitely be helpful if communication people think maybe that's my answer to your great last question, Riemann. Don't think of it as quantity as by itself. You know, quantity is relevant. You need to reach out to a lot of people to actually have it stick somewhere. But also do never forget the quality part of it. Establish a relationship, send out press releases to certain journalists instead of to everybody. Think about the quality of your message, you know, craft it a little bit differently. Start with the news, scrape some irrelevant paragraphs. You know, that part of it, it's the combination of those two, I think can make it a very successful way of communicating with journalists. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate your time. And just, last thing, please follow us on our social media and follow ANP as well. We will be providing their Twitter handle later on. But yeah, thank you so much. Send us any questions you have.